Hi, I'm Adrian Cooper. I'm Chief Product Officer for Terentia. Hello again if you saw my earlier talk. In this talk, which is called When Data Becomes the Asset, I'm talking about data management in the age of agile integration. Give me a second. So I want to drill into sort of below the systems level to the data or the metadata itself, and the importance of data management for digital transformation. So you could say that great digital innovators have recognized the necessity to connect data and systems, not just for the front end or customer facing elements, but also to join these together with the middle or back office systems. They understand this need to align online and offline. So it's not really digital transformation, in my view, if we're only changing one part of it. And organizations that only consider changing the public-facing elements are likely to struggle to deliver value over time. And I think certainly in my own experience, a lot of museums have actually largely focused on that customer-facing or public audience-driven part. Digital teams and services have been established, but mostly they're ultimately another silo, and the rest of the organization has been business as usual, of course, at least until the pandemic. So I think collectively, I mean, there are obviously great examples, but we need to work towards what's often referred to as the connected enterprise, or in this case, the connected museum. In the last talk, I introduced this concept of services as a way to help organizations to change their mindset. Services at a macro level as a way to kickstart some of the thinking about key problems and develop what I called connected processes. So a service that doesn't respect or follow, an internal organization. And so if you're thinking about developing something, there's then an increased need for organizations to find smarter and easier ways to combine the data that's traditionally held in these separate systems internally. Modern cloud native applications are generally designed with this microservices approach. And microservices are a way to enable organizations to orchestrate, bring together, and process and deliver efficient experiences and transform workflows. So a microservices approach means that although data and information sources become more distributed across the organization, the data itself is brought together or connected as needed to support the task, the workflow, or the overall service. And this is what we mean by agile integration. So we can orchestrate and bring together data from a range of different microservices, which each do something specific in order to present to the user an interface that allows them to do what they need to do for the set of tasks that's part of their service. Nothing more, nothing less. So if we recognize this need to make the alignment between the internal and the external, if you like, the workplace and the digital space, where data is connected, merged, or enhanced through a range of new digital services, what does this mean to the way we think about and manage our data or metadata? So really, what is the challenge for data in that context? So we could say that data is the currency of digital transformation, because you can't do digital transformation without transforming your approach to the data, metadata. So as we start to plan any migration to new cloud native platforms with smart connections, we need to think about how we can ensure that the data becomes or remains a key asset. So it won't be smart unless you can connect it. So for anything to be an asset, it needs to have value. And therefore data needs to have value to be treated and seen as and be an asset. And so I think there are some key challenges or key things to think about in terms of what, as a profile, we might think about, and in terms of that data in this decentralized digital ecosystem. So we need to be able to share data clearly. We need to be able to trust it. It needs to have meaning and context. So obviously that's where our taxonomies and controls come in. It needs to be consistent, comprehensive, and accurate. It needs to be accessible, controlled, secure. If you think about rights and licensing and all of those things, only the people that need to have access will get access. And of course, last but certainly not least, it needs to be machine readable. So we need to have computers to be able to look at data, interpret it, know what it means, and to be able to do something logical with it, to process it in order to make these connections. So it's clear that we need a more flexible and adaptive data management strategy in order to deliver this agile and trusted data, which then begs the questions, who's responsible or accountable? How do we improve or maintain the quality? And how do we make these smart connections or automate them in terms of what we call the data supply chain, the joining together of the data as needed to support the different processes that make up an overall service. So I think the ability to manage data as an asset across the whole organization depends on a number of things: technology, organizational culture, governance, and sort of staff employee accountability. Everyone's got to do their bit. And I think deliberately in this slide, I've made the organizational culture and governance circles bigger than the technology. And because I think that, whilst a lot of people assume that by upgrading the technology, then the data is going to take care of itself. Sadly, that's not the case. And really, it's about organizational culture and governance and thinking about things across the whole organization that's really going to make the difference. Of course, technology will and can provide some help in terms of cleaning up and sorting data, to assuming that there are rules to follow. Data transformation services can be established and scripts written to try to clean up poor data, and you can certainly use AI and machine learning to process data and try and using machine learning and OCR and things like that to actually improve the tags and other metadata about the assets, and we can also use machine learning to attempt to create links to linked open data sources and Wikidata and things like that to improve the accountability and add to the weight of that content. So where are we now? I think there are kind of two types of barriers. There's organizational barriers and there's technical barriers to this. In terms of organizational barriers, well, really, museums aren't any different to most other sectors, and because data has been managed in roughly the same way in most organizations across all sectors in the same way for the last 20 or 30 years, and that tends to be it's managed kind of independently within a departmental focus, because in turn that relates to the kind of systems that are put in place. And so if you imagine, say, in a museum context, typically museum data is designed and managed in these large-scale business area-specific applications, such as a collections management system. But even within the same sort of core area as say, collections, there is, a lot of cases, and certainly my own experience as a consultant, a strong tendency towards separate management and control, even within that area. So, for example, management of objects, archives, books, all part of the overall collection, and that they're often handled in independent systems. And I know there are those who say, well, there are reasons why, but I mean that's more historic, I think, than relevant for the future. But having independent metadata structures, having separate controlled vocabularies or taxonomies to describe the data leads to issues where it's hard to harmonize any of that data. If you know, right at the beginning, I said, of course, services don't respect organizational culture. So users don't need to know that your data is held as separately in a library collections or an archive system. They don't care. They just want to find what they're looking for by topic, subject, etc. So we need to find ways in order to bring this data together, to aggregate it and to harmonize it. And then on top of the kind of the thesauri problem, as it were, with multiple different separate systems, we've then got functions which are perhaps duplicated across the organization. So something like loans might be managed by, you know, a number of systems independently in an organization. Or it could be that loans is only managed in one system. And in order for, say, an archive object to be loaned, it has to actually be added to the collection as a temporary record in order to then have a loan transaction carried out. So these things, you know, are all examples that I've witnessed as a consultant. And this siloed approach, as it were, is perpetuated by some, of course, very basic and natural tendencies for teams to be possessive about their data. And I think that's quite understandable. And there can be a reluctance to share data or to adapt cataloging practices to support the organizational wide needs. But in a lot of cases, maybe the organization itself isn't strong enough or clear enough to actually articulate what it wants in order for these departmental systems to come together, which is then part of this, you know, service-oriented thinking. Let's think more about the outcomes that we want rather than thinking in terms of systems and features and functions, because that really doesn't help going forward. So poor integrations and other technical limitations, of course, help to enforce that kind of departmental outlook, so it becomes symbiotic. Organizational barriers are to the connected museum enterprise are in turn perpetuated by this nature of legacy systems. Something's legacy not because it's old. It can be legacy for a number of reasons, but you know, they tend to offer this single interface, single database, you know, single set of modules, and often have data entry screens which are not terribly user friendly or difficult to use. There's a lack of flexibility. And so this leads to what's sometimes called field hijacking, where users, you know, out of frustration or, you know, just put data where they want to put it, rather than necessarily in the place that is designated for it. So that in combination, perhaps with poor or lack of data validation tools, you know, if you're allowed to put a date in a text field or vice versa, then of course results in the data quality being significantly reduced. That combined with terminology control, which may not be as effective as it could be, all points towards lower quality and dirty data. So, you know, how do we properly identify, you know, people, places, objects, materials, subjects, events, etc., if the values that we're entering are simply strings of characters that have no intrinsic meaning that can be interpreted by other systems, and where the data is in fields that mean something different to what they were intended, then that only confuses the situation. So data managed through a sort of business-specific application may well also require some form of interpretation or logic layer to have meaning. If the data is exported outside the system, it can't necessarily be understood. And as we know, and it's been talked about a lot today, you know, if there are no APIs, that makes data hard to integrate, and that results in, of course, time-consuming projects to build inflexible or one-off integrations between specific systems as needed. And there's certainly been a lot of debate about, you know, what's the right level of integration between a CMS and a DAMS. But from my perspective, these point-to-point integrations are hard to maintain, and any change to either point will result in the integration breaking. And so we should be thinking more in terms of a service-oriented view rather than this system-to-system type view, because that really is an older way of thinking. So if given all of that, we look to compare kind of legacy data with our data value profile that I put up earlier, we can see that that legacy data comes with a number of issues often. So it's inflexible. It's possibly hard to share. It doesn't necessarily have meaning. It could well be inconsistent because data isn't in the right fields, or it's not being properly validated. So which means that we can't trust it completely, which means that its value is lower, and possibly again, more importantly, it isn't machine readable because we can't use any logic to interpret what it means. So how can we move towards data being seen as an asset? And I think, as we said, if organizations have relied on this business or departmental areas creating and managing their own applications and data models and taxonomies historically. But I think now there's a need to change the approach to data management so that it works more effectively across the whole organization. And that's going to be a big change for some. And so in the connected organization, data is the most significant and tangible asset. It needs to become the fuel that powers multiple use cases and initiatives, not just designed for one particular use case or project or thing. New digital services will only be as strong as the underlying data that fuels them. And we need data to be structured and machine readable in order to have use. And the value will come from the ability to collect and correlate data from different systems without need for this manual interpretation, logic, and automation. So data that's locked inside systems that has no intelligible structure or meaning can't be connected into a digital supply chain, which is then where we have to fall back on manual integrations. So as organizations shift from these large monolithic projects to more agile and service-based approaches, the concept of an organizational data catalog will become more and more important. It's going to be important to build and maintain this shared data catalog in order to understand how key data types, key entities gathered across the range of systems can be connected to support the overall data supply chain and support the needs of specific services. So you can see here some examples of the kinds of entities I'm thinking about that are currently held across different systems, whether that's objects or digital assets or products or locations or customers or rights. Again, conscious that rights are handled separately in digital asset management and collection management systems, whereas the reality is that they need to be brought together, need to be properly harmonized in a museum context, which currently makes workflow difficult for those who are trying to do that role. So we need to think about these key entities and look where this data is stored, agree how we're going to share on things like taxonomies across the organization in order to be able to orchestrate the data in a way that it can come together using machines and services to deliver the kinds of services that users expect. So in summary, I think there are a few key things to think about, and so first of all is this rethinking the data supply chain, making sure that that's done at an organizational level rather than necessarily at a departmental or departmental by department level. And I think the service-based thinking, where you're thinking about specific problems and outcomes, will help with that. There's certainly a need to increase the data modularity and to break things down and move towards this microservices and focus on the development of APIs to support this bringing together of the data. And a need to think more as an organization about the data governance. Data is an asset that everyone has to manage well. It's not it's somebody over there's department to look after. Everybody has to have responsibility, and of course we can use more modern systems to improve that and keep that maintained as we go along. And last but not least is the harmonization of metadata models. This is absolutely critical when we start to think about shared taxonomies, not only between, within an organization, but actually between organizations. Whilst, we've been developing APIs, some of the bigger organizations have managed to do that, there's certainly there's no standard around the way that they've done that. So, there are already issues in trying to draw data from different places together, if that's not itself common. So within the institution, and then institution to institution, as we start to collaborate more on these projects. So I hope that's given you some things to think about. It's not always the most exciting part, but I think if we don't get the data element right, then a lot of the other things can't follow on from that. So thank you for listening, and good night.